All right. Hello, everyone. Again, welcome to the Career Mapping Pathways to Reducing Attrition of Women of Color Engineers. My name is Kanasia, and I am the Programs Manager for the WCEC. As mentioned, we're sharing in the Q&A functionality where you're tuning in from and also how you're feeling today. I want to acknowledge the ongoing struggles for liberation, many of which deeply impact women of color engineers. These conflicts contribute to the mass disabling of vulnerable communities and are often left unaddressed. Naming this is just a small but necessary step towards collective liberation. If this is your first time joining us, this webinar is a part of regular programming by the WCEC, which is a collaborative of more than 20 STEM-focused organizations and associations working to reshape the landscape of engineering to be more supportive for women of color. We welcome you to join the work of the WCEC by visiting our website at www.womenofcolorengineers.org. I'm joined in this amazing work by our project director, Dr. Lola Rodriguez Vargas. Y'all heard I tried to, and our WCEC leadership team, Dr. Roberta Rincon from the Society of Women Engineers, Dr. Dinah Martinez, representing the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, Dr. Tiffany Smith from Advancing Indigenous People in STEM, Dr. Rochelle Williams from the Graduate Fellowships for STEM Diversity, representing the National Society of Black Engineers, and Dr. Stephanie Page from the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, who led the planning for us today. I would like to thank WePan for collaborating with us on today's webinar. A few quick housekeeping notes. Closed captioning is available via the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. As mentioned several times, there is a Q&A feature. We don't have the chat availability right now, but feel free to put your comments in there, your questions, and we will have a Q&A at the end that our panelists will be able to talk about. At the end of this conversation, we'll share a survey link for your feedback and future webinar ideas. This session is being recorded and will be made available to you all for replay soon. Therefore, we do not authorize anyone to record any part of today's session, including video, audio, or written quotes from what the speakers shared. This includes sharing session excerpts with others, including email, chat, and/or public social media platforms. Ooh, that was a lot. So now I will hand it over to both Dr. Stephanie Page as well as Dr. Dinah.
Thank you so much, Kanasia. And we are really excited for today's talk. I am going to go ahead and get my screen share going. This, to say the least, has been a labor of love for the overall WCEC team and especially for the research team members. So we want to take a minute to make some really important acknowledgments. Dr. Dinah and my hearts are really full from working with this team. So we just want to make sure to highlight a few folks. I'm going to start in green with our WCEC evaluation team, whose role was to actually tell us how we were doing, were we meeting the goals for impacts that we had over the last couple of years. And they ended up through that contributing a lot to the development of this survey. So we want to take a moment to acknowledge them. That is Dr. Yvette Pearson and Lisa Sargent of the peer group and Dr. Christopher Cox of the RUX group. We also want to acknowledge additional members whose names you might have heard or not heard. Dr. Rochelle Williams with GSFD, and also representing NSBE with the WCEC leadership team, led creation of the career mapping framework that became integrated and really foundational for this research project. Dr. Heather Metcalf was just an exceptional contributor, especially with leading our submission for our IRB and just ensuring, working with us to ensure that we are both compliant and really functioning in the ways that protect our respondents. And of course, we want to just give a huge thank you to our respondents. We understand that in order to provide this data, people who probably haven't had the best experiences with sharing their own perspectives and experiences, it's they have trusted us to provide this insight for us, and so we want to extend that thank you. We've alluded to this study, and so I want to share a little bit about the purpose of the study. Within the Women of Color in Engineering Collaborative, some of our goals were to better understand what are the experiences, the needs of engineers, and particularly and especially women of color engineers, to elevate that information and to think about it in the context of their workplaces, their careers, and within engineering as a field. What was really special about and continues to be special about this study is that it was also about where could we integrate and overlap analyses that would give us more information for how to support entities in making engineering more inclusive, encouraging, and supportive for all, highlighting the considerations for women of color engineers. This is a survey-based study, and we wanted to share just a little bit of the types of data that we collected. We did collect demographics data, including disaggregated and multi-option, gender, race, ethnicity, and disability. And by multi-option, we gave people the ability to select multiple within different demographic categories, because we also realized that typically research implies singularity in these different categories, and it implies binary in these different categories. And so we wanted to really capture um, as much as we could with data that really is reflective of women of color. We also collected data on perspectives and experiences regarding current and past positions, which will allow us to build out more knowledge on how are women of color traversing engineering. And that also included collecting data on education and training, past positions, including titles and roles and responsibilities. We do want to highlight that for purposes of today's talk, we are not sharing disaggregated demographics data for women of color. So while we highly promote disaggregation in the specific context for today, we need to ensure that we are protecting women within the disaggregated groups that make up women of color. And with that respect, we decided that it was more safe and secure at this stage to share the preliminary data with um, women of color being aggregated. I am now going to transition to my partner and fellow research team member, Dr. Dinah Martinez, to go ahead and get us into some of what we've seen in our analysis.
There we go. Now, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. So, there was a lot of questions, a lot of data, a lot of great insights and analysis that we did. So it was really hard to pick what to show to you today. So hopefully, I chose 5 questions that I want to share with you today. And, they tell kind of a story. So I'm excited to show it to you. So let's start with what's working and what's worth celebrating. When we asked women of color in engineering about their connection to their work, the response, as you can see here, was overwhelmingly affirming. A full 93% said that they enjoy achieving goals in their role. And, for me, that's not just a high score. It's a reflection of how deeply fulfilling progress and accomplishment are for us. In a field that often demands we prove ourselves twice over, the joy of completing a task, solving a problem, or delivering impact is magnified. So it's not just about getting things done, it's about knowing that the work that we're doing matters. 3 out of 4 respondents, I'm sorry, Stephanie, I'm still on the same. Oh, we're still on the same slide, yeah. The deep engagement and engineering work. We're live. Thank you so much. So then if we keep looking at the data, 3 out of 4 respondents, 76% said that they feel enthusiastic about their work. And to me, that's powerful, right? Enthusiasm is a signal of emotional investment. And it means that we're not just showing up, we're bringing, you know, the energy, the creativity, and the drive. And we're doing it in spaces that were not always designed with us in mind. Join daily tasks came in at 71%, and that tells me that for many of us, the day-to-day work itself brings satisfaction. So whether it's collaborating with a team, designing a solution, or mentoring a junior colleague, we're finding meaning in that process, not just the outcomes. Absorption in work and looking forward to daily tasks were both around 62 to 66%. And that showed that we're consistently motivated, we're present, we're engaged. And while every day may not feel perfect, we have all been there, the majority of us are finding rhythm and purpose in our roles. Now, the most nuanced result, only 43% said that they continue working if financial need weren't a factor. And that's, for me, that's not a lack of passion. It's just a reflection of reality. It reminds us that even when we love the work, we're still navigating systems, right, that don't always affirm our value. There's a pay gap, we all know it. But here's a positive takeaway to me. Despite those structural challenges, we're still showing up with excellence, with joy, and with purpose. So as a woman of color in engineering myself, I see these numbers not just as a data point, but as a reflection of our collective strength. And, as I mentioned, we're engaged, we're energized, and we're deeply connected to the work that we do. And to me, that's something to honor and something that we can build on. Now, the next slide. While the previous slide highlighted how deeply engaged and energized many of us feel in our work, this next set of data reminds us that engagement doesn't mean immunity. When asked about witnessing mistreatment in the workplace, the most frequently observed behavior was exclusion. 1 in 5 respondents said they see exclusion often or very often. And that's not a small number. It means that for many of us, moments of being left out of decisions, of conversations, of opportunities are still part of our professional landscape. Gender-based bias was the next most visible, with 14% reporting frequent observation, and race or ethnicity-based bias followed closely at 13.5%. These are the forms of mistreatment that show up most clearly in engineering spaces, and they're the ones we notice, name, and often carry quietly. But what's equally important to me here is what's less visible. Bias related to disability was observed often by just 4.2% of respondents. Sexuality or sexual orientation bias came in at 5.9%, and bias tied to other social or cultural identities like religion, language, or immigration status was seen often by only 8.7%. Now, when I was thinking about this, these low percentages don't necessarily mean that these biases aren't happening. In fact, they may be occurring in ways that are harder to detect, harder to name, or harder to report. This is a self-reporting, right? Questions in a survey. Over 87% of respondents say that they rarely or never witness bias related to disability or sexuality, and that could reflect invisibility, silence, or simply a lack of awareness. The takeaway here is that visibility is not the same as prevalence. Just because something isn't seen doesn't mean it isn't felt. And just because it's less acknowledged doesn't mean it's less harmful. The consistency, when I look at the internal consistency of these responses, it was really strong. It had a Combrac alpha of 0.84. So this means that these 6 items that we have here reliably capture a shared experience. That experience is one of navigating exclusion, gender bias, and racial bias most visibly, while also contending with other forms of mistreatment that may be quieter but not less real. So then, I know it's easy to normalize these moments, to brush off exclusion as it's just how it is. But this data, for me, it gives us language, it gives us evidence, and it gives us a call to action. Now, the next set of findings is, to me, deeply affirming. When we ask women of color in engineering about how they relate to the profession, and we ask this through identity, culture, and belonging, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Over 91% said that they find the daily work of engineering appealing. And that's not just about liking the job, it's about feeling intellectually and emotionally connected to the work. And 91% also reported satisfaction from working on engineering teams. And that tells us that collaboration, that shared problem solving and being part of something bigger are sources of joy and pride. Nearly 88% identify as engineering professionals, and 88% also feel supported by their families and elders pursuing this career. And that's really powerful. It means that for most of us, our cultural communities affirm our path. We're not just tolerated, we're celebrated. And that kind of support is a quiet force behind our persistence. Now, authenticity and representation score more moderately. About 67% said that they feel they can be themselves in engineering, and just over half, 51%, said they know others who share the racial or ethnic culture in the field. And that gap matters, right? It means that while many of us feel affirmed, we're still navigating spaces where cultural visibility is limited, and we may feel connected, but not always reflected. And here's a hopeful finding. The lowest agreement came from the item about feeling torn between cultural expectations and engineering careers. Nearly 72% disagree. And that's a sign of, to me, a sign of integration. It means that most of us don't feel forced to choose between who we are and what we do. That's resilient and that's alignment. Now, the next slide speaks to why we stay and what keeps us going. When asked what supports help sustain their careers in engineering, the most frequently selected response was financial stability and benefit. Nearly 58% of women of color cited compensation, healthcare, and retirement security as key anchors. And that's, to me, I don't know to you, but to me, that's not surprising. For many of us, the economic stability is not just a preference, it's a necessity, right? And it's what allows us to persist in environments that that may not always feel welcoming or equitable. But retention, as we can see here, isn't just about pay, it's also about people. Informal mentorship was selected by 32% of respondents, and professional development opportunities by 30%. And that tells us that trusted guidance and growth matter. And what we saw in this question is that it was not just formal programs, but relationships. So those quiet conversations, those I've been there moments that we share with each other, those mentors that are there and see us fully, these supports help us navigate complexity, build confidence, and imagine what's possible. Another one that I want to highlight is family support at 22%, and identity-based and professional societies at 20%, like the ones that we have represented here today, also play meaningful roles. And these are the spaces where we feel culturally affirmed and where we're not the only one, right? And when we're reminded that we belong in a field where isolation might be common and community, right, is retention. Lower rank supports like recognition, work-life balance, resources, and representation point to persistent gaps. So these numbers suggest to me that many of us aren't being fully seen, supported, or celebrated. And the lowest selections, sponsors, and networking opportunities highlight a lack of access to power, leveraging relationships. And these are the connections, right, that often drive advancement, and they're not fully reaching us. So what does this mean? It means that retention is shaped by more than just passion. It's shaped by pay, by mentorship, growth, and belonging. And if organizations want to keep us, they need to invest in all of it, not just the paycheck, but they also need to invest in the people, the pathways, and the places where we feel seen. And my last slide or data question that I wanted to show to you is about how advocacy and representation matter. So this goes deeper, right? This goes into purpose. And when we ask women of color in engineering what sustains them is, not just what keeps them employed, but what keeps them committed, the answers were rich, layered, and very powerful, as you can see here. Nearly 21% credited advocacy and mentorship as the most transformative support. And these weren't just those helpful relationships, these were transformative relationships. And they mentioned champions, both formal and informal, how these champions help respondents see their own potential, access growth opportunities, and overcome self-doubt. And for many of us, someone believing in us was the turning point. I can see that's true for myself. And that belief didn't just encourage, but it reshaped our trajectory. Professional identity and purpose were also central for 17% of respondents. Engineering isn't just a job, as I have been mentioning, it's part of who they are. The kind of identification reinforces persistence. It means that even when the path is hard, the calling that we have is clear. We can also see that 14% said that they stay in engineering to pave the way for others, so paying it forward. Also, intellectual fulfillment was cited by another 14%, and community impact and STEM outreach came in at 10%. So supportive relationships, those relationships with family, with spouses, with friends, were also mentioned by 10%. And these are the emotional anchors, right? The people who hold us steady when the work, gets heavy. And while passion and cultural influences surface less frequently, as you can see here, they still matter. They remind us that meaningful tasks and early exposure, so, those conversations that you have in the kitchen table, those formative moments can shape, those lifelong careers. And when we take together all of this data, right, it tells a story of resilience, but also, to me, of transformation for us, for women of color in engineering. Staying in the field is not just about personal success. As we can see here, it's about changing the profession. It's about making space for ourselves and for others, and it's about making history. And finally, what comes next? So all of this is not just a reflection, it's a call to action. And organizations need to invest in mentorship and growth that actually works, call out bias and follow through, see our identities as strength, and put lived experience at the center. I hope, all of this was as interesting to you as it's been to me. And we will go back to Stephanie now.
Thank you so much, Dinah. And I want you all to hold on to some of the data that Dinah showed because I will actually show what we found when we disaggregated based on career stage. And for assignment of career stage for women of color respondents, we asked them, where are you currently in your career based on 5-year blocks where we had folks distinguished from having less than 1 year in their career and being in their career more than 20 years. And so the majority, just to share, we had a lot of early career women of color, that 1 to 5 years. Next was women of color being in careers over 20 years. But what we were overall excited to see was that we were hearing from people at different stages in the career, in their engineering careers. And I think that will provide us a lot of opportunity for interpretation, as you will see over the next few minutes. So, what are some of the career stage specific considerations that may reduce attrition of women of color engineers? When we asked respondents about their careers, we gave them the opportunity to respond in 5-year blocks, years 0 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 20, and 21 plus of their careers. They had the opportunity to add in up to 5 positions within those windows. Typically, people didn't add more than 2 or 3. Um, and at each of those positions, we asked a series of questions. One of those questions included what factors influence their decisions to leave those positions. And we saw some interesting variations, but just to highlight, very strong as we see on the right, the left, again, where we're looking at percentage of respondents who agreed that they had their decision to leave had been influenced by lack of promotion or advancement opportunities. And that is aligned with data that we see from a number of different spaces that promotion and advancement opportunities can oftentimes be occluded for, or having those can be occluded for women of color. We also saw just interesting variations that kind of where signals just kind of popped out in the data. And Dinah and I both use engineering speak. So we saw a pretty strong signal for this with women who were women of color who were 20 plus years into their career even. And that says a lot because typically we think that being further along in your career provides more stability, provides more likely kind of acceptance and experiences that kind of keep you there. But there still seem to be some things going on, basically. So we are still seeing experiences of bias and discrimination. We're still seeing organizational culture misalignment. We're still seeing burnout and mental health concerns. Some things that might seem low, but we will always encourage giving attention to are changes in caregiving or family responsibilities. There have been a lot of great places, including the National Academies, that release a report on supporting caregivers in STEM. So what we're essentially seeing is across different career stages, we are seeing differences in the likelihood that these contexts influence decisions to leave positions. We also saw contexts that were related to being promoted and accepting those promotions. Sometimes we also saw respondents say that they wanted to try something new, or maybe there was a lateral position that was an opportunity that they wanted. We also saw the opposite end of the spectrum, where there were a lot of contexts that led to reductions in force or to other terminations for other reasons, such as division closures, plant closures, and things of that nature. So the overall call to action from that data we thought was to continue to evaluate promotion and advancement practices and adapt them to be more inclusive. There was a really strong signal around promotion and advancement that was in line with some of our hypotheses given what's shown in data from other studies. But I think we also saw this really strong signal around mental and emotional support resources with a particular peak that sat in the early and later career stages. And so that could be a space for organizations to focus more on what are the unique supports related to mental and emotional health that would support employees, women of color engineers. And we saw that really what was coming out too was that there is maybe more of a need to create scaffolding for support and for resources that accounts for the unique needs for early and later career women of color overall. So to touch back on some of the data that Dinah highlighted, looking at witnessing bias and exclusion, early career women of color are more likely to witness those biases and exclusions that are related to or that go beyond context of just gender and ethnicity. So even though those numbers were looking small as it related to sexuality or sexual orientation, disability, or other social or cultural identities, these were really strongly held within younger people or people who are earlier in their careers. And I'll touch on a little bit of how we could think about what that data could mean. But we also saw that there were some groups that were enriched based on career stages. So within the past 12 months, women of color who were more than 20 years, over 20 years in their career, were actually had an increase in likelihood that they would share that they witnessed other people being excluded. And I think that says a lot too, because oftentimes, again, we assume that people further along in their careers are just less likely to witness or see it or experience it. Um, and that can contribute, that's been attributed to different features such as assimilation, desensitization. Oftentimes later in their career, those individuals are more influential when it comes to the culture and environment that other people experience, so that maybe they might be less likely to witness exclusion, but it seems like that is still being held up. And in this case, it's actually being enriched when we look at people further in their careers. But again, as Dinah said, witnessing and the reality of it happening are two different things. And so we have to really allow ourselves to sit with the complexity and complicated nature of exclusion and bias, particularly with what we know about the systems that we navigate as women of color engineers. And I wanted to highlight, speaking of women of color who are further along in their careers, it was interesting to me that disaggregating by stage actually showed that women of color who were further along in their careers were less likely to say that they witnessed bias along the lines of race, ethnicity, or gender. There are a lot of interesting studies that we hope to see come out soon that are looking at whether or not, particularly within your own identity groups, shared identity, whether or not you become desensitized over time to when you are witnessing and experiencing bias or exclusion, sorry, that is within a group for you. So that was another interesting piece of data. But to deepen the call to action in terms of addressing bias and building cultures of accountability, as Dr. Martinez shared, there is something to me here that kind of still calls us as a community to better understand what supports us in recognizing and responding to bias related to sexuality, sexual orientation, and disability. We could ask several different questions about why we see certain signals stronger for early career women of color. Could it be that it's more likely that they're aware? Is it more likely that their eyes are just wide open and bright as they're entering a new career? We could also ask questions about whether gender and sexual minoritized folks and disabled people are being excluded from engineering to such an extent that the bias is less likely to be witnessed because the people who would experience these biases are not in the spaces where we're working. Again, these could sit within a lot of different potential explanations. And there are still the questions of our organizations ensuring employees know what bias looks like and have safe recourse for when that bias is witnessed. A big question that I have as we're digging deeper into the data is, do correlations between career stage and reduced likeliness indicate impacts related to assimilation? Does the need to assimilate mean that we can both love what we do while still doing that within systems that are not inclusive or for us? To move a little bit forward, and Dr. Dinah shared what were these top resources that supported and that have positively impacted our respondents' decisions to remain in their careers. We see things spread out. Again, we see things shift when it comes to looking across the different career stages. That sponsorship number, interestingly for me, was 100% attributed to women of color who were in year 6 to 10 of their career. And so there are a lot of things that we could potentially think about. As Dr. Martinez, as Dinah indicated, financial stability, that's going to be there, but we also see other contexts that are meaningful. And so it's more than just, are we addressing pay equity and inequity when it comes to benefits and compensation? And so when we look across some of those different factors, I just wanted to share the same data that Dinah shared, but again, looking across different career stages, we're going from light to dark. You're getting further along in our careers of our respondents. Similarly, we're seeing that things are differently prioritized in terms of being deemed that top three of positively impactful. And what can we pull out? Well, when we kind of relisted and show the data, we can see that even when we look across the different career stages, there are things that are consistently across all career stages. There are things that are associated more with different career stages. So again, pulling out sponsors, we knew that financial stability and benefits were there for all career stages. Advocates tend to pick up, people tend to understand or reflect positively on advocates. But also, it appears that people are distinguishing between advocates and sponsors, and that is really important. The difference between someone showing up for you in a way that is more about advocating for you and for folks who are similar to you versus people who are utilizing their power and position to help you advance that is a distinction that I think we should be acknowledging and thinking about. What are we doing within our organizations that are providing the stage specific needs and supports? And then looking at a little bit later in career stages, we're still seeing financial stability there. We're still seeing formal mentorship and mentorship programs. We're still seeing advocates. So those are consistent with what Dinah shared, but they are rearranged in terms of how they are prioritized as women of color are reflecting from these different career stages. So I think that that tells us that it is worth looking at, how do we scaffold, how do we provide resources that are in better alignment? So again, how do we ensure that for those women who are going into that 6 to 10 years, that they have access to sponsorship, that people know what it is to be a good and effective and relational sponsor? It appears, especially for the first 5 years, that this is a time period where affinity groups, this is where we saw signals around identity-based and professional societies, as Dinah mentioned, and other psychosocial supports are particularly important and critical. We're also seeing that advocates were highly impactful across all career stages. So how are we supporting people in understanding how to identify advocates for themselves and how to be advocates for others? And as I mentioned, there are ways in which I think we can be more effective within our organizations when we consider the variation of needs that women of color may have based on career stage and the intersection of identity. I am going to take a brief pause and just check in with Kanasia to make sure that we can get to our questions. We kind of came in prepared. If we had a lot of questions in the Q&A, we would take a brief moment. And if not, we have a few more slides to share on some of our additional analyses.
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions, but we can kind of like combine them to make more high level
Okay.
if you want. So one of them is you all have quite mentioned a couple of times throughout this sharing mentorship, sponsorship, and advocacy. So can you talk about how these roles like differ from each other and why, if at all, they are all necessary to support women of color engineers? So looking at mentorship, sponsorship, and advocacy, if they're different, similar.
Yes. And typically, the way that we think of mentors, which, and I want to add another term, you have advisor, supervisor, you have mentors, you have advocates, you have sponsors. So typically, when we're thinking about our advisors and supervisors, that tends to be a little bit more transactional, tied to your current role and what are certain benchmarks that you need to meet that they are responsible for supporting and ensuring that you meet. So their job being done is tied to your job being done. So that's kind of what we see with the advisor supervisor role. Sometimes advisors and supervisors can move into the mentorship type of space. Mentors don't have to be advisors and supervisors, but mentoring tends to be more relational. So when we think of formal mentoring, we do think of that being attached to people who are within our same organization, whether we are at an institution of higher education or whether we are in our actual jobs, positions, career roles in other sectors and spaces. So when we think of, I think a good analogy is when we think of formal mentoring, I like to say that it might not be that you are a part of a program that directly connects you to a mentor, but you can be, but typically you will have the same affiliation. That is typically what's related to formal mentorship. Informal mentorship is oftentimes what occurs outside of your job, your position, your current education role. That's oftentimes where we see mentoring roles with organizations or like Vanguard STEM, for example, or any of our STEM professional societies represented within the WCEC. We have various mentoring programs where it is with someone who has understood navigating the things that align with your goal and the pathways that align with your goals, and they're able to really build relationship with you to support you in navigating that. And it is mentoring tends to get a lot more personal, meaning it will account for you more holistically overall. When we get into advocates versus sponsors, that is one that can oftentimes trip us up a little bit. Advocate is they're going to drop your name. They're going to speak highly of you. They're going to listen to how people are talking about you. They're going to go into places and if you know whether it's that there's a job that they're like, I think you should do this. Maybe within work, they're looking for someone to lead another project, and they're the person who's more likely to say, "Oh, I think this is who it should be." So they're basically kind of like I call them your personal name dropper. That is your advocate. And so advocates and sponsors can kind of get a little bit blurry in some ways. We can think of it as a spectrum. They can overlap again into the roles of advisor, supervisor versus mentor, but there's a distinct behavior that kind of anchors both ends of the advocate and sponsorship spectrum. Advocates can be internal or external to your organization. They can also what's a good word? They can also not even be engineers, right? They're just your name dropper, basically. And when we think of sponsors, what's really critical in how we think of sponsors is to think about how somebody is positioned and they're using their proximity to power and influence to directly get some doors open for you so that you can invest in yourself as best you can. So it really is like all of these roles can overlap, but there are distinctions in how you would identify them. And I'll take a moment to see if Dinah has anything to add.
Think you covered that perfectly, but just, to summarize, right? This is how I think about it. A mentor shares their experience and their advice, right? And then a sponsor, like Stephanie was saying, is the one that recommends you, is the one that promotes you and open doors for you. And then the advocate, right, is the one that speaks up for you and challenge the bias that it's seen or supports you. So yeah, I think you covered that beautifully.
Sure.
Thank you. Any other questions, Kanisha?
Yeah, just one more to wrap up. And just for the both of you, just thinking about the findings that you all mentioned, highlighting that despite like the systemic challenges and barriers that women of color engineers experience, they or you all still remain very deeply committed to the field. So just in your like personal experiences or those with whom you've collaborated with others with, what gives you hope about the future of engineering? Folks staying committed despite the things that they experience.
Mm, Dinah, do you want to go first? Um,
I think, yeah, sure. I think, what I've seen personally and what we see reflected in the data too, again, a lot of it wasn't really surprising, but now we have the numbers, right, to back up a lot of the experiences that we have had and that others have, right? And to me, what gives me hope is that, we, as we saw in the data, we enjoy this work, right? We feel passionately about this work and we show up because of that and because we want to open doors for others. I truly believe that you have to see it in order to be it, and a lot of us are showing up in that way and opening spaces for others, and that's the way to see change, to continue to do that. So that gives me hope.
yeah, and I agree absolutely with Dinah. And to add, a lot of what gives me hope is related to the coalition building that's happening. We have a lot to stand on in the social movements over the years that have been led by women of color. And with coalitions today that are coming out when as it's related to engineering, we're understanding more and more that the social movements don't require being STEM. They don't require having STEM degrees. There is a lot of knowledge there. And I think as women of color, we grew up knowing that and understanding that. And we're able to bring that into the coalition building space. We're able to bring that into research projects such as this, where we're also able to take this data and say, well, what is the action? And what you're seeing today is really high level. This is us kind of just being, I think, both excited and itching to kind of see what's there in the data. But this is also just like a small proportion of the questions that we ask, which is why we're also so grateful to our respondents. These we know that these are people with a lot going on in life, and they took the 15, 30 minutes to respond openly and authentically to these questions. And again, there's the relationship of trust that is implied with someone taking this type of survey. So those are the things that give me hope, is that we are actually recognizing the foundations that brought us to where we are as women of color. The kitchen tables, as Dinah referenced, are part of why we're here. And so whether or not those movements were about pay equity, whether they were about health care for women of color, whether they were about justice for women of color's the communities, whether it was about just the ability to go to college, all the different layers of what we have as foundations are incorporated into the coalitions that we're building to move efforts forward. So that's where my hope sits. It has made me incredibly hopeful to see the responses come in because it was telling us that we at least will have some insight to begin to strengthen the recommendations that we make. And as Dinah said, it's not just about reflection, it's about what we're going to do with it. And so we live in a time where I think the evidence is trying to kind of be broken down and erased. But we're continuing to show more evidence that indicates, yes, women of color, we want to be here. We want to thrive in this space. We want to solve problems for our communities, for our country, for the world, for the universe. So here we are. We're not leaving. We're going to continue to be resilient. And we are going to continue to ensure that other women of color will have more opportunity than what we had. Is that a fair?
Ooh, yeah, y'all ate this one up for real. Speaking of like coalition building and movement work, how can folks connect with you all? Stay attuned to your own personal like research that you're doing, as well as like those in professional societies. So are you on LinkedIn website? Like we can't drop it in the chat, but I'm sure folks would, because there were some questions about how to access some information after the fact. So how can folks connect with you all?
Yeah, some things will come through from the WCEC. If you haven't signed up from the newsletter, please go to womenofcolorinengineering.org. Get more information on other things that we've done and continue to do. That will also be, again, where you can sign up to receive information as things move forward. Myself and Dinah, we're both on LinkedIn. You can use our names as they're spelled to find
Yeah, like how I have it in here, Dinah L. Martinez. That's how you can find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah. And I'm Stephanie with no E. That will help you tremendously if you take that E off. If you leave the E on, 7,000 Stephanie pages will pop up. But I think if you take the E off, it's only like two or three of us in the entire LinkedIn user groups. So yeah.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you both, Dr. Stephanie and Dinah, for sharing your time and expertise with us. An outsider looking in, I'm not an engineer, but with you all's call to action from this data, I'm really looking forward to what the WCEC does with this information, what organizations do with this information to create a more supportive environment and bolster the experiences of women of color engineers. So I just wanted to thank you on behalf of everybody uh, who joined us today for sharing with us. For the WCEC's upcoming webinar, we will be collaborating with the Society of Women Engineers. So if you all connect with us through our website, again at www.womenofcolorengineers.org. There you could find information about our LinkedIn, our newsletter, and some of the other programming work that we're doing. So we would like for you all to stay connected with us. And as mentioned, all materials from this webinar, as well as our feedback survey, will be sent to you all first since you registered and attended this event. Once we fix it all up and make it beautiful for your eyes. So thank you all again so much for joining us. And again, thank you, Doctors Page and Martinez, for sharing your expertise with us. I hope you have a great rest of your Friday and even better weekend. See
Bye,
y'all.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.